"If you fight this, Karina, I'll bury you in legal fees until you can't afford a hot meal," Misha threatened, his gaze as icy as the window panes of the home they built together. Rosenda snickered, trailing a manicured finger down his lapel. "Let her have the dead-end plot up the ravine, darling. It's barren and broken, just like her." With a patronizing sigh, Anders, their crooked attorney, slid the contract across the mahogany desk. Trembling but dry-eyed, Karina pressed the pen to the paper. She surrendered her empire for an abandoned shack, stepping out into the howling Montana blizzard. The rusted tires of Karina Eriksson's 1998 Ford F-150 crunched over the icy gravel of the forgotten county road. The windshield wipers squeaked, fighting a losing battle against the heavy, wet snow that characterized early November in the Gallatin Valley. For hours she had driven away from the glittering lights of Bozeman, Montana, leaving behind the multi-million-dollar ranch she had spent 5 years building with her own blood, sweat, and inheritance. Now, it belonged to Misha Nielsen, the man who had promised her forever, only to legally blindside her with the help of his new lover, Rosenda Klin. Karina slammed the truck into park. Before her stood the culmination of her humiliating defeat, a dilapidated, rotting structure leaning dangerously to one side, surrounded by overgrown sagebrush and skeletal lodgepole pines. This was the generous settlement Anders Copeland, Misha's slick, high-priced attorney, had forced upon her. 100 acres of seemingly barren rock and a cheap, abandoned cabin located in a dead-end ravine near the Gallatin National Forest. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening in its hostility. Karina stepped out into the biting wind, pulling her worn canvas Carhartt jacket tighter around her frame. The cold seeped through her jeans, but it was nothing compared to the ice in her chest. She approached the porch. The wood groaned under her boots, spongy with years of neglect. The front door hung off a single, rusted iron hinge. When she pushed it open, the smell of mildew, animal droppings, and damp earth hit her like a physical blow. Inside, the cabin was a single, cavernous room of despair. A rusted iron wood stove sat in the center, its pipe disconnected from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through a cracked, grime-covered window. Karina dropped her duffel bag onto the scarred floorboards. She had $50 in her checking account. Her credit cards had been frozen by Anders's legal maneuvering. She had been stripped of her dignity, her life savings, and her future. Misha's parting words echoed in her mind. "You don't have the stomach for real business, Karina. Go play house in the dirt." And Rosenda's mocking laughter, sharp as broken glass, had followed her out the door. They had expected her to break. They expected her to crawl back to her sister in Seattle, begging for a couch to sleep on, leaving this worthless land to be foreclosed on by the county. Karina sank to her knees in the center of the dusty floor. The sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to crush her lungs. She screamed, a raw, visceral sound that tore from her throat and vanished into the empty Montana wilderness. She cried until her eyes burned and her chest ached. But as the shadows lengthened and the temperature inside the cabin plummeted below freezing, a different sensation began to take root. It wasn't despair. It was the spark of survival. She pulled a heavy, wool Pendleton blanket from her bag, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. She forced herself to stand. If she stayed on the floor, the Montana winter would kill her before Misha's betrayal ever did. She walked over to the broken wood stove. She would not die here. She would not let them win. This cheap cabin was meant to be her tomb, but as she stared into the dark, empty belly of the iron stove, Karina made a silent, unbreakable vow. She was going to burn their empire to the ground. The first 3 weeks were a brutal lesson in endurance. Karina learned to wake before dawn, breaking the ice in a galvanized bucket just to wash her face. She learned the agonizing labor of chopping frozen firewood with a dull axe she had found in the collapsed shed. Her hands, once soft, were now covered in heavy calluses and raw blisters. It was during one of these grueling mornings, as a blizzard threatened to bury the valley, that Sally Nichols arrived. Sally was a local legend, a woman in her late 60s, with skin like tanned leather, eyes like chipped flint, and a battered Chevy Silverado that seemed held together by rust and stubbornness. She lived 10 miles down the ridge and had noticed the faint wisps of smoke finally rising from the long-abandoned Erickson plot. "You're chopping that wood like it owes you money, girl." Sally's gravelly voice broke the morning silence. She leaned against the rusted bed of her truck, a lit cigarette dangling from her lips. "But you're holding the axe wrong. You're going to snap your wrists before December." Karina lowered the axe, panting, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "Who are you?" "I'm the only neighbor you've got who won't try to eat you," Sally replied, grabbing a pristine Grandsforce Brook, splitting maul from her truck bed. "Name's Sally. Heard what happened in town. Misha Nilsson is a snake in a tailored suit, and that lawyer of his, Anders, is the grass he slithers in. But crying about it won't patch your roof." Over the next month, Sally became a mentor, a savior, and the mother figure Karina desperately needed. Sally taught her how to patch the rotting shingles with tar, how to properly insulate the drafty walls using old wool and fiberglass, and how to hunt the small game that scurried through the snowdrifts. The physical labor was agonizing, but it cleared Karina's mind. The venom of her heartbreak was sweating out of her pores, replaced by a quiet, calculating strength. It happened in late January. The wind was howling, a terrifying squall rattling the cabin's bones. Karina was prying up a warped floorboard near the hearth to replace it with solid oak Sally had brought over. As the rotting pine splintered away, her crowbar struck something metallic. Karina frowned, brushing away decades of accumulated dust and mouse nests. Wedged tightly between the floor joists was a heavy, blackened iron lockbox. Her heart pounded as she retrieved it. The latch was rusted shut, but a sharp strike from her hammer shattered the brittle metal. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were documents dating back to 1888. They were the original homestead patents, filed by her great-great-grandfather. But it wasn't the property lines that made Karina's breath catch in her throat. It was a heavy, wax-sealed addendum from the territorial governor. Absolute and unyielding riparian and mineral rights to the Deadwood Creek aquifer. Karina stared at the archaic cursive, her mind racing. She had studied hydrology and land management in college before Misha had convinced her to drop out to run their business. She knew exactly what this meant. The dry creek bed behind her cabin wasn't dead. The water had simply receded deep underground, and according to this document, which predated the statehood of Montana and superseded all modern municipal zoning, whoever owned this cabin held the absolute, indisputable rights to the massive underground aquifer that fed the entire lower Gallatin Valley. This land wasn't a barren scrap. It was the master key to the region's most valuable resource, water. And Misha, in his arrogant haste to dump the worst piece of property on her, had legally signed it all over to her name. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Karina's face. The cabin had just become her fortress. 50 miles away from the freezing isolation of Deadwood Creek, the stolen Erickson Ranch was bathed in the warm, golden glow of thousands of fairy lights. It was late February, and Misha Nilsson was hosting an engagement party that bordered on the grotesque in its opulence. Ice sculptures shaped like rearing stallions melted slowly near the heated outdoor fire pits, while caterers in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. Misha stood near the massive stone fireplace of the grand hall, clad in a bespoke Italian tuxedo, feeling like the king of Montana. Beside him, Rosenda Klin draped herself over his arm, showing off a 5-carat diamond ring that caught the ambient light like a weapon. She laughed loudly at a joke made by a local senator, her eyes scanning the room to ensure everyone was watching her. But the true guest of honor had not come to celebrate. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung open, and the ambient chatter of the room died down instantly. Georges Tesch strode in, flanked by 2 men holding thick metallic briefcases. Czech was a billionaire developer, a predator who built sprawling, ultra-exclusive eco-resorts for the global elite. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore a stark black suit that absorbed the light in the room. He ignored Rosenda's eager wave and walked straight up to Misha. "My study." "Now," Czech rumbled, his voice low enough that only Misha could hear, but sharp enough to draw blood. Panic flared briefly in Misha's chest, but he quickly masked it with a practiced smile. He kissed Rosenda's cheek, murmured an excuse, and led Czech down the hallway to the ranch's executive office, the office that had once belonged to Karina. Anders Copeland, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quietly excused himself from the bar and followed them inside, locking the heavy mahogany door behind him. Czech didn't sit down. He gestured to one of his men, who opened a briefcase and dumped a massive, rolled-up topographical map onto Misha's desk. It was marked with angry red circles and complex geological data. "I've spent the last month running deep-core hydrological surveys on the lower valley, Misha," Czech began, his tone deceptively calm. "The valley where you assured me I could build a 300-unit resort with an artificial lake and an 18-hole golf course. And the land is perfectly zoned for it, Georges," Misha said smoothly, pouring a glass of bourbon to hide his trembling hands. "The local council is already in my pocket. Zoning means nothing if my guests turn on the faucets and dust comes out," Czech snapped, slamming a heavy hand down on the map. "Your lower valley is dry, Misha. The state's new drought protocol has restricted the municipal water table entirely. We drilled 5 test wells last week. We hit bedrock every single time." Anders stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. "Mr. Czech, there must be a mistake. The Gallatin Valley sits on the Deadwood Aquifer. There are millions of gallons under the surface." "Yes, there are," Czech's geologist chimed in, pointing a laser pen at a specific, elevated ridge on the map. But the tectonic shift from the 1959 Hebgen Lake earthquake altered the subterranean flow. The aquifer retreated. The only viable access point, the only place where the pressure is high enough to pump the volume we need, is right here. At the top of this ravine, Misha leaned over the desk, his blood running cold as he followed the laser pointer. It rested dead center on a 100-acre parcel of rocky land. "That's—" Anders choked, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to mop his suddenly sweating brow. "That's the scrap parcel. Who owns it?" Czech demanded, his eyes narrowing into black, dangerous slits. "Because I have already poured $50 million into the surrounding infrastructure. I am highly leveraged, Misha. If I cannot secure the water rights from that specific plot of land, this entire $200 million project goes bankrupt. And if my project dies, I will legally dismantle Nielsen Holdings. I will take this ranch, your cars, your accounts, and I will leave you bleeding in the dirt." Misha swallowed hard, the expensive bourbon turning to ash in his mouth. He looked at Anders, who looked like he was about to faint. My ex-fiancée," Misha stammered, the words physically hurting him to say. "Karina Eriksson. She owns it." Czech stared at him in utter disbelief, a slow, terrifying realization dawning on him. You excised the most valuable piece of real estate in the entire county, the literal key to the region's water supply, and gave it to an ex-lover you publicly humiliated? It was an abandoned cabin, Anders pleaded, his voice cracking. It wasn't on the modern grid. I didn't run a deep historical title search. Suddenly the office door flew open. Rosenda stood in the doorway, her face pale, having listened through the heavy wood. You told me she was ruined, she shrieked at Misha. You told me we had everything. Shut up, Rosenda, Misha roared, the charming facade shattering completely. Czech buttoned his suit jacket, his expression carved from stone. I don't care about your domestic squabbles. You have 48 hours, Misha. Go to that cabin. Buy the land back, steal it, burn it to the ground. I do not care. If you don't have that deed on my desk by Monday morning, you are a dead man. As Czech left the room, the distant sounds of the lavish party outside sounded like a funeral dirge to Misha Nilsson. He had handed his enemy the weapon that could destroy him. And now he had to march into the snow to beg for his life. Misha did not come to Deadwood Creek with an apology. He came with a bulldozer. He knew Karina, or at least he thought he did. She was soft, sentimental, and easily overwhelmed by conflict. If waving a check in her face didn't work, terrorizing her would. By 7 a.m. on Monday, a massive yellow Caterpillar D8 bulldozer was grinding its way up the treacherous, deeply rutted logging road toward the cabin. Misha followed close behind in his black Range Rover, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. Beside him sat Anders, clutching a briefcase, and a corrupt county code enforcer named Deputy Higgins, who owed Misha several gambling debts. Higgins had a fake condemnation order freshly printed in his pocket, declaring the cabin structurally unsafe and an environmental hazard, authorizing immediate demolition. As the convoy crested the final hill, the cabin came into view. Misha slammed on the brakes, the Range Rover skidding on the packed snow. He stared through the windshield, his jaw slack. The rotting, leaning tomb he had abandoned Karina to was gone. In its place stood a fortified homestead. The roof had been entirely rebuilt and sealed with heavy black tar and fresh shingles. Thick, solid oak beams braced the porch. The surrounding brush had been cleared back 50 yards to create a defensive perimeter, and towering stacks of chopped firewood formed a makeshift barricade around the foundation. Thick, defiant smoke plumed from a newly installed stone chimney, but it was the sight on the porch that made the blood freeze in Misha's veins. Karina stood at the top of the wooden steps. She wore a heavy Carhartt jacket, her hair pulled back into a tight, practical braid. The softness Misha remembered was completely eradicated from her face, replaced by eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Montana winter. Resting casually in her gloved hands, angled slightly toward the ground, was a classic Winchester Model 1894 lever-action rifle. Up on the newly reinforced roof, partially hidden by the stone chimney, sat Sally Nichols, an unlit cigarette in her mouth and a 12-gauge shotgun resting across her knees. "Keep driving, boys," Sally's gravelly voice echoed down into the valley. "You're lost." Misha stepped out of the Range Rover, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He tried to force a confident, authoritative smile, but his face twitched. "Karina, what is this? Put the gun down, you're being ridiculous. You're trespassing on private property, Misha." Karina's voice cut through the mountain air, sharp as a hunting knife. She didn't raise her voice, but it carried absolute authority. "State your business or get back in your car." Deputy Higgins stepped forward, puffing out his chest, his hand resting on his service belt. "Ms. Erickson, I'm with county enforcement. I have a court order here condemning this structure. It's unsafe for habitation. We're here to level it for your own safety." "Is that so?" Karina tilted her head, a dark, mocking smile playing on her lips. She gestured toward the massive bulldozer idling noisily in the snow. You brought a wrecking crew for my safety? How generous of Nilsson Holdings. Karina, please. Anders scurried out from behind Misha, waving his briefcase like a white flag. We don't want this to be ugly. Misha is prepared to offer you $500,000. $500,000. Cash. Just sign the quitclaim deed, and you can walk away rich. If you fight this demolition order, you get nothing. $500,000, Karina mused, taking a slow step down the porch stairs. To buy back the absolute, senior water rights to the Deadwood Aquifer. The exact aquifer Georges Tesch requires to keep your fake empire from collapsing into federal bankruptcy. Misha stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained entirely from his face. How? Who told you that? I didn't just chop wood out here while you were playing King, Misha, Karina said, stopping at the edge of the firewood barricade. I found the 1888 territorial land patents under the floorboards, the ones your brilliant lawyer was too lazy to search for. I didn't just claim them. I drove to the state capitol. At that moment, the heavy wooden door of the cabin opened again. A tall, sharply dressed man with silver hair stepped out onto the porch, adjusting his tie. It was Arthur Vance, the most feared environmental and water rights litigator in the Pacific Northwest, a man who ate corporate developers for breakfast. Vance walked down the steps and handed a thick, bound folder to a stunned Deputy Higgins. That is a federal injunction, Vance said smoothly, his voice carrying lethal weight. Issued at midnight by a U.S. District Court judge, it recognizes this property as a historically protected, sovereign water access point. It permanently bars Nilsson Holdings, Georges Tesch, and Gallatin County from operating heavy machinery within 10 miles of this property. If that bulldozer moves 1 inch forward, you will be arrested for federal contempt, Deputy. And Mr. Nilsson will be facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Higgins looked at the papers, paled, and immediately took 3 steps back, distancing himself from Misha. Misha lost his mind. The realization that he had been completely outplayed by the woman he had discarded snapped whatever sanity he had left. "You bitch!" he screamed, his face turning a mottled, violent purple. He lunged forward, grabbing for the gate of the barricade. "I'll kill you! I'll tear this shack apart with my bare hands!" Clack, clack. The metallic sound of Karina racking the lever of the Winchester echoed like thunder across the ravine. Misha froze, staring down the dark, hollow barrel of the rifle, leveled perfectly at the center of his chest. Karina didn't blink. Her hands didn't shake. "Take 1 more step onto my land, Misha," she whispered, her voice dropping to a deadly, hollow calm. "I dare you." For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind howling through the pines and the rumble of the idling bulldozer. Misha looked into Karina's eyes and saw the terrible, beautiful truth. The girl he could bully was dead. The woman standing before him was forged from iron and ice. Misha slowly backed away, his hands trembling violently. He turned and practically crawled back into the Range Rover. Anders was already inside, sobbing in sheer terror. The bulldozer threw itself into reverse, the driver wanting no part of a federal standoff, retreating rapidly down the mountain. Karina slowly lowered the rifle, watching the black SUV disappear into the snowdrifts, leaving only the sound of the free-flowing creek behind them. The siege was over. The empire was hers to break. The courtroom in the Gallatin County Courthouse smelled of old wood polish and anxiety. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Karina sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a simple, sharp grey suit she had bought at a thrift store in town. Beside her sat an older, fiercely intelligent water rights attorney that Sally had introduced her to, a man who had taken the case on contingency because, as he put it, he loved watching arrogant city boys drown. Across the aisle, Misha, Rosenda, and Anders looked like a shipwreck. The stress of the last 3 weeks had aged Misha 10 years. His suit hung loosely on him. His eyes were bloodshot. Rosenda chewed furiously on her manicured nails, the illusion of her high society grace utterly shattered. But the most dangerous presence in the room sat in the gallery. Georges Sech was there, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of granite. Anders stood up, his voice cracking as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we are filing for an emergency injunction to override Ms. Eriksson's archaic water claim. The economic development of Gallatin County relies on the Nielsen-Czech project. Ms. Eriksson is holding municipal progress hostage, based on a technicality from the 19th century." The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate maneuvering, peered over her glasses. "Mr. Copeland, the technicality you refer to is a federally recognized homestead patent that predates statehood. Furthermore, I am looking at a countersuit filed by Ms. Eriksson's counsel, alleging massive fraud, forged signatures on the original asset separation agreement, and perjury." Anders choked, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "Your Honor, those allegations are baseless." "Are they?" Karina's lawyer stood up, smooth and confident. "Your Honor, we have subpoenaed the emails between Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Copeland, detailing a deliberate conspiracy to hide the true value of the estate from my client during the separation. We also have a signed affidavit from a notary public who admits Mr. Copeland bribed him to stamp documents my client never signed." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rosenda whirled on Misha, her eyes wide with panic. "You told me the paperwork was clean. You said she couldn't touch us." "Shut up, Rosenda," Misha hissed, his composure entirely broken. The judge slammed her gavel down. "Order. Mr. Copeland, given the severity of these allegations, I am placing an immediate freeze on all assets belonging to Nielsen Holdings. Furthermore, I am referring your actions to the State Bar Association for review. The injunction to seize Miss Eriksson's water rights is denied with prejudice. Her claim is ironclad." In the gallery, Georges Sech stood up. The sound of his heavy shoes on the hardwood floor silenced the room. He walked past the barricade, stopping right behind Misha's chair. "Mr. Sech," Misha pleaded, turning around, sweat pouring down his face. "Please, I can fix this. I just need a little more time. I can find another water source." "You lied to me, Misha," Sech said, his voice quiet, terrifyingly calm. "You leveraged assets you didn't legally own, and you jeopardized my capital. You are a liability." Sech then turned his gaze to Karina. He looked at her, not as a victim, but as an equal, an adversary worthy of respect. "Ms. Eriksson, if I were to abandon Mr. Nielsen here and now, would you be open to negotiating a water lease with my company directly? A highly lucrative one?" Karina stood up. She looked at Misha, who was practically hyperventilating, his empire crumbling into dust before his eyes. She looked at Rosenda, who was already inching away from Misha, realizing the money was gone. And she looked at Anders, whose career had just ended in a single afternoon. Karina met Sech's gaze. "Mr. Sech, my water is not for sale to anyone who does business with thieves. Find another valley to pave over." Sech stared at her for a long moment, then gave a slow, respectful nod. "Well played, Miss Eriksson. You are a formidable woman." He turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom. With Sech gone, the financial collapse of Misha Nielsen was complete. The trap had sprung, and the vipers had choked on their own venom. Karma in the American West is rarely swift, but when it arrives, it hits with the devastating force of an avalanche. 6 months later, the summer sun baked the Gallatin Valley, turning the wild grass into a sea of gold. The local Bozeman Chronicle lay on Karina's kitchen table. The headline on the business page read, "Nielsen Holdings declares Chapter 7, Bankruptcy. CEO faces federal fraud indictment. Misha had lost everything. The banks had seized his luxury cars, his downtown condo, and the remaining parcels of the ranch. He was currently awaiting trial, facing years in federal prison for the financial crimes he committed trying to cover up his fraud. Rosenda had abandoned him the moment the asset freeze hit. Rumor had it she had fled to Los Angeles, trying to latch onto an aging tech executive, her reputation in Montana permanently destroyed. Anders Copeland had been officially disbarred and was working as a shift manager at a fast food franchise on the outskirts of Billings, a ruined man terrified of his own shadow. Karina folded the newspaper, a deep, settling peace washing over her. She didn't revel in their destruction with gleeful malice. Rather, she felt the quiet, solemn vindication of a storm that had passed, leaving the air clean and pure. She walked out onto the porch of her cabin. But it wasn't just a cabin anymore. With the leverage of the water rights, Karina had secured a massive agricultural grant from the state to preserve the aquifer. She had hired local contractors, including Sally Nichols as her foreman, to expand the property. The rotting wood was gone, replaced by beautiful, dark-stained timber. A massive stone chimney dominated the roofline, and a wraparound deck overlooked the breathtaking expanse of the Bridger Mountains. Horses grazed in the newly fenced pastures below, and the sound of Deadwood Creek, now legally protected and flowing free, provided a constant, soothing melody. Sally pulled up in her battered Chevy, tossing a bale of hay into the paddock. She tipped her dusty Stetson as Karina walked down the steps. "Looking good, boss," Sally grinned, wiping sweat from her brow. "Got the new fencing up on the north ridge. Place is starting to look like a real empire." "It's not an empire, Sally," Karina smiled, leaning against the sturdy wooden rail. The wind caught her hair, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage. "It's a home." She looked back at the structure that was supposed to be her grave. Misha had given her the cheap cabin because he thought it would break her. He thought the isolation, the cold, and the despair would shatter her spirit. He hadn't realized that under the immense pressure of the Montana winter, coal turns to diamond. The fire they had set to burn her down had only forged her into steel. Karina Eriksson breathed in the wild, untamed air of her land. She was the master of her own fate, rooted as deeply into the earth as the ancient pines, powerful, unbroken, and fiercely free. Life has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, even when it comes wrapped in the form of our worst nightmares. Karina's journey reminds us that the situations designed to break us are often the very crucibles that forge our greatest power. When people betray you, when the world strips you down to your foundations, remember that rock bottom is the perfect place to build a fortress. Your worth isn't defined by what people take from you. It is defined by what you choose to build with the pieces left behind. Stand tall in your own truth and watch the universe align in your favor. If this story of resilience, hard karma, and rising from the ashes moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that touch the soul and inspire the warrior within you. Let's keep building our strength together. See you in the next video.